God, I pity you. The read will come out 5 years from now. It'll take you that long to go through that damn book. I just wanted to say briefly, I don't think we have any reason for accounting for why so many great writers of weird fiction emerged at this time. I mean, we're talking not only Machen. I presume we're not actually going to talk about Machen much, because we need to talk about some of these other folks. But we have Blackwood, we have M.R. James, we have Lord Dunsany, we have William Hope Hodgson, Walter de la Mare, much ignored. I hope we'll talk about him a little bit. American side of the water, we have Robert W. Chambers and F. Marion Crawford and Mary Wilkins Freeman and Edith Wharton, and then the Anglo-American Henry James. I mean, what a tremendous outpouring. Why? I have some ideas. I don't think anybody can explain, but I think I have some ideas. Part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that many of these writers were building upon a growing legacy of weird, ghostly fiction that had been accumulating throughout the 19th century. Poe, Ambrose Bierce, the Victorian ghost story writers. I think M.R. James was the culmination of that tradition. Le Fanu, I mean, just so many others who are building up a really solid legacy of weird fiction. I think there was also an element of, or something we have to mention about intellectual history. Throughout the course of the 19th century, science had been making great strides in the explanation, if we want to call it that, of natural phenomena. Darwin, Huxley, astronomers, and so many others. Turn of the century, we have, revolutionary findings of Einstein and Max Planck and others. I think in part, some of these weird writers were responding to that tradition by saying, not so fast, we don't quite understand the universe as well as we think we do. I think some of that comes out in Machen, some of that comes out in Blackwood, and maybe some of these other writers. That's just two possibilities of why some of these things, some of these great writers emerged. But I think partly it was just the luck of the draw that we just had this great constellation of weird writing. I think we might just start by each of the panelists just picking one of these writers and
Well, yeah, I agree. Well, you just mentioned Blackwood and Machen, and they certainly share a same sort of sensibility in their fascination with nature, for sure. But I think they had different views on it, just from reading their stuff. And I think Machen had this pure belief in the supernatural and the fairy folk, and it was sort of untainted, sort of a bit probably more perverted than Blackwood's. Blackwood seemed to be a little untainted, and I don't know if that was their religious upbringings. I know Machen was Anglo-Christian, and his father was a pastor. But definitely, you could see when you read both of them the influence that nature had on them. But definitely different viewpoints about nature's causes and effects, landscape to the mind, that type of thing.
I mean, with Machen as well, it's obvious that he was quite influenced by sort of Darwin. There are several scenes where, at the climax of the story, he goes through a cycle of devolution, and it's very obviously that he's influenced by Darwinian notions of retreating in evolution through stages of evolution towards protoplasm, basically. I mean, that's the end of the novel of The White Powder, for example.
Oh, yeah.
I'd just like to expand on something that S.T. was saying. In, I think, about 1876, if I remember rightly, the Society for Psychical Research was founded. In other words, people were starting to be interested in the world of the spirit, or whatever you call it, as a scientific or quasi-scientific phenomenon. And then you get people like William James, brother of Henry James, writing varieties of religious experience. Again, looking at the whole area of the spirit from a kind of rationalistic or experimental point of view. So people were becoming interested in it not as a phenomena of religious belief, but as something that you could look at objectively. And I think you see this, and as it were, it coming from the psychological area. Le Fanu, of course, was the first person to write a psychological ghost story, Green Tea, and M.R. James was a great follower of it. He was a kind of skeptic, actually, M.R. James. He was, I think all the great writers of that period were, in some senses, skeptic. Something that Simon Bestwick on St. Joshi's panel said is worth correcting, if I may. He said that many of the great ghost story writers were lapsed Catholics. Actually, lapsed Anglican is a much more accurate phenomenon, because if you look at the Benson brothers, sons of Archbishop of Canterbury, H.R. Wakefield later, another bishop's son, Hugh Walpole, another bishop's son, M.R. James, the son of an Anglican clergyman, Le Fanu, the son of an Anglican clergyman, William Hope Hodgson, the son of an Anglican clergyman, Blackwood, the son of but a lay evangelical lay preacher. All these people had a religious background. Henry James came from a very strict Presbyterian, I think, was it Plymouth Brethren or something like that? Anyway, a rather rigid religious background, and there are others who I'll remember later. But they all, to some degree, moved away from their religious background, but they still retained a sense of the numinous. And you might say M.R. James was the most conventional, but he was somebody who refused to take holy orders, though it would have been a perfectly natural thing for him to do, as Cambridge dons did in those days, to take holy orders, but he didn't. And I think he was, au fond, a skeptic. And he said things like, well, I'll believe in a ghost when I see one. And I think it's this area when the psychic became a matter of study, investigation, rather than the matter of belief that is the important stimulus. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I wonder how much of a religious skeptic M.R. James was. I think a lot is made of the fact that he didn't take holy orders, but and he was put under pressure by his father and his mother to do so. One of his older brothers did take holy orders and became an eminent. He became the dean of Worcester Cathedral, I think. Throughout his life, M.R. James preached. He was a regular, as provost and dean, first dean and provost of King's College, Cambridge, and then provost of Eton. He showed great interest in the chapel. His sermons, I think, which are available to read in the University Library in Cambridge, they wait to be collected in a way. And I think reading his sermons, I'd love to know what M.R. James actually thought about spiritual evil. Now, my guess is from stories like the ash tree, that he himself couldn't fully believe in it didn't believe in external supernatural evil. However, there was this doubt in his mind. He was skeptical, I think, about science rather than about religion. And I think the skepticism of someone like Professor Parkins in Oh Whistle I'll Come to You, who is shown to be a clear materialist who will not accept the superstitions, doesn't even know what a Sadducee is, and he's challenged about it by the someone who doesn't know the Bible, in the same way as M.R. James and Arthur Machen and all these people. I think it's very significant. All these people were the sons of clergymen, and therefore they knew the Bible. They probably had it read to them. They probably read it themselves every night. They probably also knew a lot about. You come across, is it Fox's Book of Martyrs? Like M.R. James says you was reading. You come across that. There's another writer of very small amount of weird tales, Lucy Ann Boston, who's a children's writer. In her memoir, she writes about reading Fox's Book of Martyrs, what extraordinary impression that made upon her. So there's a bit in his memoir where M.R. James says, as a child, nothing inspirited him more than to learn that St. Levinus had his tongue cut out and was beheaded. This kind of very colourful medieval and Victorian, non-rational approach to religion, I think informed the imaginations of a lot of these writers.
Can I just follow on that last remark? Something that is being left out of all of this is that if you have read the several very serious, well-written books by a man called James Webb, who discusses the late 19th century and early 20th century in terms of the openness in Europe generally, including Great Britain, to spiritual ideas mainly coming from the East or coming from ancient British ideas. And this is when you get all the sort of Krishnamurtis, the Theosophists. You get, in 1908 or so, the figurehead of the Baha'i religion coming on a long tour right through Europe and North America. And you get just an absolute sort of sea within which all these other things were swimming. And that really was deeply important for large parts of society at that time. And of course you get it with other people like Yeats and the Golden Dawn, with Lady Gregory, with her ideas about Irish mythology and so on. It all creates an atmosphere within which, however much people might have been skeptics, they were, I think, in many ways swimming within this wider sea. And just to say it, there is one other explanation for the emergence of M.R. James, which is King's College. James, of course, was closely affiliated with the college, but back in about the 30s, the college librarian was a man called A.N.L. Mundby, who produced an excellent short collection of supernatural tales. And then more recently, I myself am the Kingsman. So clearly it is the college, nothing else, that has this impact.
Yeah, I can follow up on not that, but on the Eastern mysticism thing, because that comes out in Blackwood. You know, he was raised as initially as in this strict what's called evangelical movement, inspired by his father, who was a very important figure in the government. I mean, what is the title? Something to do with the like supervisor of the post office or whatever title was. Stevenson, Arthur Blackwood, and Blackwood, Algernon rejected that teaching by absorbing Hinduism and Buddhism. In fact, one of the books he read early on was something called Hindu Aphorisms. And later he came to believe, apparently quite fervently, in reincarnation. It was a serious belief of his. And in fact, he developed a strange relationship with this woman, I've forgotten her name. He dedicated almost every single book of her, MSK is her initials, Maya Scott something or other. Dedicated almost all his books to her because he felt that he had met her in a past life and had fallen in love with her then and apparently was in love with her now. And a lot of his books deal with reincarnation and things like that.
Wasn't he also a member of the Golden Dawn?
He was Golden Dawn and the Psychical Research Society. He tells, I think only briefly in the Golden Dawn,
right.
But the Psychical Research Society he took quite seriously. He has several articles about going to some reputedly haunted houses and apparently experiencing some weird phenomena there. Lord Dunsany is a bit out of this tradition, because so far as anyone can tell, he was actually an atheist. In fact, in the year that he wrote The Gods of Pegana, his first book in 1904, it was published the next year, apparently he read Nietzsche, and that sort of comes out in The Gods of Pegana in a number of ways, because what Dunsany is doing there, I mean, he says, he gives a standard explanation, oh yeah, my prose style is based on the King James Bible. Well, sure, he read the King James Bible, he learned its prose rhythms well enough, but he was not a believer as far as anyone can tell. And in fact, some of The Gods of Pegana does reflect Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, both in prose style and prose rhythm, and in some of its conceptions like eternal recurrence and things like that. And yet Dunsany also shared with Machen and Blackwood a sense of this need to reunify with the natural world. In fact, much of Dunsany's work has that as its substratum. There's one faint connection, interestingly enough, I'm not sure that people generally know about this, between Dunsany and Machen. I don't believe they were actually well acquainted at all, or very slightly. But very late in Dunsany's life, in fact, after Machen had died, Dunsany wrote a foreword to The Hill of Dreams. I believe this was as late as 1954, is that right, Daryl? 54 for a reissue of The Hill of Dreams. I confess I can't remember what he says about it. Well, nobody obviously liked it, and admired Machen, and I think he understood that there was at least some similarity between them in their hatred of industrial civilization and a need to return to nature.
Yeah, I can't speak much to Dunsany. The stuff I have read, though, does sort of echo what you say about the prose style from the King James. I find it's a very rhythmic and tonal type prose.
The first book I read by Dunsany was on Conversations with Dean Stanley, which deals with reincarnation.
Yeah.
And I mean, was there any serious...
But very frivolously, I mean,
Right.
there's and another, I mean, this is way beyond the Edwardian period, of course, but one of my favorite works of Dunsany is a very late novel, 1950, called The Strange Journeys of Colonel Polders, which I think is one of the lost classics of fantasy, where a colonel, a British colonel, offends an Indian swami. Here's that Eastern connection again. In a club, and then the swami curses him. He puts a curse on him, whereby this colonel is forced to occupy successively the bodies of various animals, and that's the whole novel is just about that. At one point he's an eel, at another point he's a dog, he's a cat, he's a horse, he's a fox. It just goes on that way. And Dunsany has an amazing ability to recreate what it might be to be a fox or an eel or a cat. He was actually very close to dogs. He had many dogs in his lifetime, and that's why he wrote Dean's Family, because it's about the idea of a clergyman, remembering his past life as a dog. But that novel is so charming, it's so beautiful, and it's very hard to find. It was only published in a rather small UK edition in 1950, and ought to be reprinted.
What's it called?
The Strange Journeys of Colonel Polders, Polders. How about Delamere? Somebody must
Yes,
talk about Delamere.
I think that he is one of the preeminent writers. I suppose you always like the writers who do the things that you're most interested in. And what he is fascinated by is the sheer oddity, the strangeness of humanity, human beings. I mean, there's a lot more to his writing than that. But if you look at some of the great short stories of his, Mr. Kemp, A Recluse, Crew, which is a favourite of mine, Seaton's Aunt, of course, and others which I should remember. They're all about the strangeness and the oddity and sometimes the extreme sinisterness of human beings, and that's what makes his work really rather unique. Some writers of the supernatural are not necessarily very interested in human personality. Lovecraft is a good example. He's interested in other things which are very interesting, but to me are not quite as interesting as Delamere. Of course, he writes beautifully, but it is this strong sense of spiritual unease to be got by, just as in Mr. Kemp, for example, just coming across a person who invites you in, and suddenly you find that this person is unbearable. Is it he or the recluse who shows the hero or the narrator sort of photographs of dead people? I can't remember. Yes, but anyway, the sense of unease is generated through the sense of a human personality that has somehow gone wrong. All Hallows is admittedly a sense of a place that has gone wrong somehow.
I mean, I think De la Mare is, in a sense, an antecedent of Robert Aikman. I'm not sure that Aikman necessarily was influenced by De la Mare, but they both tend to be a trifle opaque at times, and a little hard to understand, but beautiful prose, and again, emphasizing just strangeness of humanity, the strangeness of existence in general. But I think De la Mare much undervalued, and his poetry, I tell you, there's a number of very strong weird poems, among the many other great poems of other kinds as well. So he was a fine poet as well.
So would you say, Reggie or ST, that he has a much more human approach and maybe wasn't as affected by the, in the Victoria era, by that, when people started being skeptics or taking a more scientific view? Is he more humanist view?
De la Mare had no particular religious beliefs. I mean, I think he was like many of these writers, that he was a genuine agnostic, if you like, someone who was passionately interested in investigating the sort of unknown, non-materialistic side of human life.
Could I come in and talk about non-materialistic? This has always interested me a bit. We see in a lot of these writings echoes of spirituality, even though people may be skeptics or, like myself, an atheist. And we treat a lot of them, I mean, James is a good example of this, as ghost stories. And yet if you look at James very closely, you'll see that there aren't so many ghosts as physical, human or non-human entities, but they actually, these little spiders. They're not ghosts, God knows what they are actually. And you'll see that, and you see it again in someone like Lovecraft. The Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward, for example, is it brings the dead in a sense to life, and that's what he's doing, he's getting salts of the dead. But they're not ghosts in another way, they're just the souls of the dead. And there's a physical, everything tends to be very physical, very materialistic in so many of these stories in reality. And that may be a reflection of their skepticism or their pro-science attitudes and so on. But at the same time, of course, they're not physical things in the purely normal human sense at all. They have almost a contamination of the spiritual, a contamination of the world beyond perhaps a religious view and so on. And that does strike me as something that creates lots of ambivalence in these stories. And the reason for that precisely, you probably need a psychologist to work about. But I don't think it's worth knowing that we're dealing with this kind of double vision.
Do we want to talk about the Bensons?
Yes, that's interesting. I was thinking about, there were three of them, all three were ghost stories. AC's ghost stories I don't rate terribly highly. RF is an interesting, RH I should say, thank you very much, Robert. As opposed to EF, yes. RH is an interesting example of somebody who had, as it were, too much belief to be a really good ghost story writer. His two volumes, A Mirror of Shalott, and I forget the other, are very interesting. He was incidentally, there were all three of them were the sons of Edward White Benson, the Archbishop of Canterbury. All three remained, as it were, more or less Christians, but R.H. became a Catholic priest. And like many converts, he had the zeal of a convert and was very dogmatically a Roman Catholic. And it's an interesting example of the difference between him and AC and EF. AC records in his diary walking with R.H. Benson once, and they both agreed that the vast sum of what we know, of what can be known, was unknown, and that there were vast tracts of things that we couldn't possibly know in the spiritual realm. But AC remarks in his diary, I think that our age imagines he can see a little further than he really can. And this is it influences his, I call them ghost stories, because I don't think he probably wrote actually about revenants from the dead because, according to his Catholic beliefs, they either went to hell or maybe if they went to purgatory they could return. But he had rather rigid views. Father Girdleston's tale records quite interesting a sort of presence of evil which is stopping a churchman from building a chapel, and that's quite effective, but it is so sort of rounded off. And of course, as Orwell remarked about one of C.S. Lewis's books, the tension comes out of it because because of his beliefs, that good will triumph, So there's no lingering sense that possibly we will be, sort of possessed. The evil somehow remains. It will all be conquered by God eventually. And so he sort of takes out so much of what we find paradoxically attractive and exciting and interesting, the sense of danger, the sense of perpetual danger about the supernatural story. But E.F., who was by far the more sort of lax and skeptical of the three, is I think, the best and most interesting of the three as a writer. He simply writes about things that happen, and there is one famous story like caterpillars, I believe, in which cancer takes a kind of physical embodiment of a caterpillar, which is something which would never occur to us, somebody like R.H. Benson.
We have to remember that at least E.F., maybe some of the others, I know E.F. Benson attended that famous meeting of the Chit Chat Society where M.R. James read his first ghost stories in 1893. Were the other brothers?
They probably.
They weren't present at that night.
Right, but they must have known. And yet it took E.F. Benson's first ghost story collection didn't come out for nearly another 20 years. He obviously wrote some of them earlier than that, but The Room in the Tower came out in 1912, and his other ghost story collections in the 20s and 30s. Something that somebody was saying here triggered my memory for another writer who I think is also much undervalued, and that is Robert Hitchens. When I was reading Robert Hitchens some years ago, I was overwhelmed by some of the incredible power of his work. One of his early short story collections has the odd title, Tongues of Consciousness. Maybe it's a biblical phrase. I don't know what that means, but that has, of course, his famous story, How Love Came to Professor Gildy, about the ghost who falls in love with, a living person and drives this Professor Gildy, who's a very, cold, rationalist individual who has rejected human emotion, and it drives him mad, maybe drives him to suicide, I can't remember, but an incredible conception. But that's only one of some really powerful stories in that volume. I started reprinting some of Hitchens's stories with a Seattle publisher, Midnight House. We only got one volume out though before the press sort of collapsed. But I hope to do a big volume of Hitchens's work with Centipede Press one of these days. But he wrote many story collections all the way up to like 1950, and every one of them has at least a couple of really powerful weird tales that are worth looking up.
So he wasn't Edwardian at all, was he?
Well, Tongues of Conscience is 1900, and then some of these other collections take to 1905, and then go on from there. He actually had a lot of stuff about reincarnation, or specifically metempsychosis. A lot of his stories deal with human souls apparently sent into the bodies of animals. There's one story called The Black Spaniel, in which it appears as if a human soul has gotten into the body of a spaniel, and some very strange things happen thereafter. But he had a very long career, born, I think, almost exactly Machen's dates. In fact, I think it's 1863 to 1950, almost identical with Machen's lifetime.
Did he write a book called The Green Carnation, which was a sort of
Yes.
satire?
Oh yes, his first book, his first book, 1894, I think, was The Green Carnation, published anonymously in a clear, a very tart satire on Oscar Wilde and his circle, and that got him famous. And then he wrote many works thereafter. He was actually a very popular writer, and he was a best-selling writer of not for his weird work, but for mainstream novels like Belladonna and other things. Garden of Allah is another
famous film. With
Yes. And actually, one of his later novels, The Paradine Case, or Paradine Case, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, was filmed by Hitchcock. So he was a prominent writer of that period, now almost entirely forgotten.
Do we know if he had an Anglican father? Pastor?
Can't remember. But actually, he wrote an autobiography in which he actually makes pretty clear, I quoted a long part of it in my introduction to that book, clear his belief in spiritualism at a minimum, if not something more than that.
He was English.
He was English, yeah. Robert Hichens, Hichens. Well-known writer of the period, now sadly forgotten. How about, okay, I'm embarrassed to say, is it Oliver Onions or is it some other pronunciation? I can't remember how you pronounce it. Is it Onions? Okay, because it's sort of a pseudonym, isn't it? Or that name is derived from his mother's family or something like that. But anyway, he published the great story of The Beckoning Fair One, which in a sense is a takeoff of Professor Gildy's story about again a weird love story between a living man and apparently a female ghost. But again, that also is just the tip of the iceberg of Onions' weird work. We know, of course, the Dover reprinted his collected ghost stories. That book had first come out in 1935, and they reprinted it in the 70s and kept it in print for a long time. I think his first collection was called Widdershins in 1911, so more or less Edwardian. And he wrote several other weird collections thereafter in the 20s and 30s.
It was H.H. Ewers.
It's Evers, I think, actually, in German. I don't know all that much about him. I think he came just a little later, teens and 20s, I think, is when his story collections date.
Because I remember reading some of his work, and it's just it's a bit different. It's just sort of the type of work that just leaves impressions. Like I can't really remember any of the stories, but they've left impressions.
Well, I mean, the one story I know of his, of course, is The Spider, which was included in the Dashiell Hammett, the Dashiell Hammett weird anthology, Creeps by Night, in 1931. And Mr. Lovecraft read it, and a couple of years later wrote a story very clearly based upon it called The Haunter of the Dark. I think Lovecraft's story is actually a little better than Evers, but The Spider is a damn good story.
How about, sorry, no, I just say, I think we ought to remember that practically every writer of note in that period wrote supernatural stories. I'd particularly like to mention Kipling, who wrote some marvelous ones, and who, in a couple of stories I can think of, anticipated the kind of ambiguous, strange kind of stories that Robert Aycliffe wrote. I'm thinking in particular one which is not so well known, but is rather remarkable, called Mrs. Bathurst, which I think is one of the first short stories ever to mention the cinema. And it's about a man who sees a woman he sort of possibly loved that is haunted by on the cinema, and he there's a film show going around showing this film of her. And in those days, cinema didn't show stories; they just showed ordinary events which astonished people. And Mrs. Bathurst is seen getting out of the train and then wandering off, and he thinks that she is looking for him, and he keeps on going to see this cinema, and eventually he jumps ship, and then he turns up and has obviously died a very strange death. And why he is haunted by this film, why he thinks he's looking for her, is it some sort of, there's a sort of guilt implied, but it's magnificent. Another is The Wish House, which is an extraordinary story, a late Kipling story.
Of course, I mean, Kipling obviously started writing much earlier, and I think many of his great ghost stories date from the 1880s, 1890s, one of his early collections, of course, The Phantom Rickshaw, dates to 1888, and has some wonderful pieces in it. Although in the Edwardian era specifically, he wrote that great ghost story called They, one of the most haunting pieces you will ever find. Extraordinarily poignant and frightening at the same time. How about some of the Americans? Should we throw it about anything about Chambers and Crawford and Edith Wharton?
The Chambers, like The King in Yellow, much of his work wasn't really supernatural, was it?
Definitely weird, though.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, Chambers, his first novel, his first book was a kind of series of sketches about Paris, artistic life, bohemian life, because he was, called In the Quarter. Then the second book was King in Yellow, which also has that sort of Parisian atmosphere in it, but definitely some incredibly powerful, weird stuff.
Yeah.
So that third volume was The Maker of Moons, had, again, some really good weird stuff. The next volume, The Mystery of Choice, I think is a spectacular volume, has some really fine stories in it. From then on, the weird content of his work sort of declined, because then he turned to writing very popular historical novels and sort of romance novels, and it became also a hugely best-selling writer. In fact, in 1907, he wrote the #1 best-selling novel of that year called The Fighting Chance, which I think is a historical novel, and he became fabulously wealthy and built a huge house for himself in upstate New York and things like that. But as Lovecraft says, well, that was his aesthetic damnation, because he, and quite frankly, those romance historical novels are pretty awful, But they made him a lot of money, and then the weird stuff didn't, so he stopped writing the weird stuff.
Yeah.
But every now and then he came back to it. 1904 was a very strange book called In Search of the Unknown, which is a kind of a weird sort of horror science fiction hybrid, and has the opening section of that. It's an episodic novel, really kind of like Three Imposters in some ways, the Machen novel, but because it's really short stories kind of stitched together into a novelistic format. But those first 5 chapters of In Search of the Unknown were published as a separate short story earlier called The Harbor Master, and a tremendous sea horror story. Which reminds me, how William Hope Hodgson, we haven't talked about him now.
Yeah.
Gotta talk about Hodgson.
Yeah, I just what I gather from Hodgson, the few pieces I've read, there's a cosmic horror element to it, but he's and there's also cephalods. His work is very spongy. That's the best way, flabby and spongy.
Very material horror.
And he also wrote the Carnacki, right?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's obvious the Carnacki stories, the psychic detective, were based on Blackwood's John Silence, because I'll tell you, John Silence, the book John Silence, Physician Extraordinary, came out in 1908, and because of apparently a very clever advertising campaign on the part of the publisher, Emily Nash, became a huge bestseller, which had the good effect for Blackwood that he was allowed that the money he gained from the sale of that book allowed him basically to kind of spend the next 5 or 6 years off in Switzerland doing nothing but writing, and that's when he wrote. In that 5-6 year period, he wrote a wonderful novel called The Human Cord. He wrote Incredible Adventures. He wrote Pan's Garden. He wrote 2 or 3 other major works of weird fiction.
It was The Centaur.
The Centaur was in that period also. Yes.
A great novel.
That's a poignant autobiographical novel, but also a weird novel. It's really, I call it his spiritual autobiography. If you read that core of Blackwood's work, you've read some of his greatest works, because frankly, the work he wrote later on tailed off in quality thereafter. But John Silence was clearly the influence for the Carnacki stories, because they were first published in the Idler in 1910, at least the first 5 or 6 of them. just 2 years after John Simon.
I wonder what you think of the idea which occurred to me, and I'm not quite sure, whether the Carnacki is in a touch of a parody of the whole notion of the psychic detective. Because psychic detectives, John Silence is a good example, can be terribly pompous and ponderous. I mean, Hesalius in Lefanu is another example. And Carnacki is very, very sort of brusque. He comes out with a lot of jargon and has all this paraphernalia, and he has this famous Sig-Sand manuscript full of rather cod medieval English language. And I think that there's a touch of the send-up about Carnacki.
Well,
but I may be wrong.
The fact, no, it's very plausible. The fact of the matter is that of those, how many, 8 or 9 Carnacki stories, several of them end non-supernaturally. I mean, it's what's called the explained supernatural. It turns out that these spiritualist phenomena are just trickery. So he undercuts the supernatural in some of those stories, as Blackwood never would have done in the John Silence story. So, something else I was just going to think about, but F. Marion Crawford, I think he too doesn't get the recognition he deserves. Again, he was a hugely popular and actually also well-respected mainstream novelist. Again, started well into the, in the 1880s, if not earlier, and his career spanned, several decades until he died in 1909. And for whatever reason, his landmark collection of weird stories didn't come out until maybe either right around his death or a little after, called Wandering Ghosts. I think it had a different title in the UK, but that had his great story, The Upper Berth, and many other really good stories. But again, most of those were written in the 1880s or 1890s. But he also wrote The Witch of Prague, which is a pretty good weird novel. But again, that's earlier. That's 1891, I believe. But that actually, in a sense, that connects with Hodgson. The importance of Hodgson, I think, is the fact that he wrote horror novels. There were simply not very many horror novels being written. I mean, of course, Stoker was writing Dracula and Jewel of 7 Stars, but just a few works. But Hodgson wrote 3 horror novels, one after the other, or at least published them. Ghost Pirates. Boats of the Glencarrig, 1907, House on the Borderland, 1908, and The Ghost Pirates, 1909. His 4th novel is not horror, it's a sort of the apocalyptic fantasy, The Nightland, an enormous work about it's like 300,000 words. As long as my history of weird fiction is probably as difficult to read. But The Nightland is a very strange concoction. Maybe we have 5 minutes, but anyway, of course, Hodgson also wrote short stories aside from Carnacki. There's some, and he as an ex-sailor, excelled in the sea horror tale. In fact, I think even Joseph Conrad actually praised some of Hodgson's sea horror stories.
I get a sense what they at the early 1900s, at the beginning of the Edwardian era, that in society and culture itself, things were optimistic. Not that the fiction necessarily was, but then that after the Great World War, things turned. People turned to fascism, nationalism, and everything was just sort of topsy-turvy. Do you think the fiction changed much after that? Did Blackwood and Machen's approach change?
Machen clearly was really disturbed by the war. I mean, he wrote this, as a very, devout individual. He couldn't understand how Christians could be fighting Christians in this manner, and he wrote a little treatise called "War and the Christian Faith" in 1918. Quite frankly, a poor piece of work trying to somehow justify the war on Christian terms, but. By that time, frankly, Machen's fictional career was practically over. Through necessity, he was forced to write a lot of journalism throughout the teens, 20s, and into the 30s, until finally he got the Civil List pension in 31. But And then even his later fiction is, quite frankly, rather poor. Both The Green Round and then those two later collections, Cozy Room and Children of the Pool, frankly, don't contain much good work. And similarly, Blackwood's work tails off after the war also. That great period of writing really ended in 1914. He continued writing, but it's pretty uneven work. Some of his late stories are actually pretty good. There's a late collection called Shocks that came out in 1935 that actually has some very interesting work. Actually, some pseudo-science fictional writing derived from some advanced scientific conceptions at the time. But otherwise, those what Lovecraft called the Titans had kind of faded out, and M.R. James also his two later collections of ghost stories I don't think are as strong.
I think A Warning to the Curious, which is probably written in 1922, I think, is M.R. James's response to World War II, rather obliquely. And this is definitely, not actually, one of his bleakest, one of his best. Yeah. Perhaps his bleakest as well. I mean, it has a lot in common in terms of its bleakness with Count Magnus. A similar thing happens. A traveller suffers for no good reason at all. In fact, for far less good reason in Count Magnus and in Warning to the Curious. And Count Magnus was written long before the war, so I don't think it's quite true to say that M.R. James's view became particularly bleaker, but certainly A Warning to the Curious, if you read it as a response to World War II, World War I, then I think you get more out of it than just a cold reading would, I think. Also, I just wonder, it's always struck me there's a vague connection between the Angel of Mons and the Legends of the Three Crowns in Warning to the Curious, in that these are two medieval myths created by their authors, which have taken on a life of their own since then, and they both deal with national security.
Something strikes me looking at the composition of this panel, which is, as far as I can tell, all men.
Sorry.
And while there were some women writing ghost stories and similar things back then, Edith Wharton the obvious example.
Amazing.
Yeah, amazing.
A few, but not a large number. That is partly just a social phenomenon, but it did strike me when I think about, and correct me here if I'm wrong, that may well be, that if you look at early folk tradition, it's very common to have a story about usually a man who falls in love with a woman who turns out to be not quite human. She may be a mermaid, she may be a sprite, or whatever it may be. And there are dire consequences from this union. But I'm not aware that this theme was picked up at all later by the late Victorians or the Edwardians. And whether that has anything to do with a more male perspective or quite what, I'm really not sure. But does that strike anyone as being remotely close to the truth?
Well, I just go back to those two stories I mentioned, both Professor Gildy and The Beckoning Fair One, which do have this weird sort of supernatural romance element between a human and a human male and a ghostly, or at least something other than a human female.
Well, Machen's Great God Pan, of course, is about. Is a version of that myth, if you like, albeit with scientific trappings.
Yeah. Anyway, some questions or comments?
One writer occurred to me while the panel was discussing this. Someone else who was the son of a clergyman and who's not really noted for weird tales, but wrote some excellent ones, John Buchan.
Yes.
And he fits well into that period, because the Watcher by
the Treasure, yes.
He's before he's in the Edwardian period, certainly.
Yeah, although his the standard weird collection of the Renegades Club is basically as late as 1928, although possibly the stories were written or published earlier than that. But he certainly was publishing in the first several decades of the century, and some of the novels he wrote are quite weird.
I was thinking of the religious upbringing.
Yes,
His father
yes,
was a Scottish minister.
yeah, and he had some interesting ideas in terms of trying to evoke horror from classical antiquity, classical myth.
Yeah, the Wind of the Portico.
The Wind of the Portico is an example of that, and there's some other ones beyond that one. Somebody else had a comment?
Sorry, you have to wrap it up. I'm afraid.
Are we done?
Yeah.
Okay, that's it then.
Sorry.